Good afternoon, everyone. Democracy as a competition of ideas hinges on citizens' free access to information to form opinions. A vibrant media and information environment is therefore fundamental for a liberal and open society. In the 21st century, the democratization of the public sphere and vast availability of information has had many benefits, but has also driven fragmentation and disinformation. How can liberal societies strike a balance between freedom of speech and an evolving definition of truth? How does it influence democracies? I will discuss these questions in this year's Max Schmidheiny session in cooperation with the Max Schmidheiny Foundation, which, as a partner of the Gallen Symposium, is devoted to the promotion of freedom and contemporary societies. So welcome, please, with me on stage, Lord Griffiths.
Sophia, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's a very great pleasure to be back in St. Gallen again. Since I've arrived, I was asked to take part sequentially in 4 different occasions. And I'm afraid you have me here today on occasion I'm not sure I know too much about, certainly in terms of technology, because my home address is Jurassic Park. And of one thing I feel certain, for everyone of my age, I'm sure they know their fellow citizens. It's my great pleasure to say a few words in the introduction to this year's Max Schmidheiny lecture or session, and to say really at the beginning how sad I am that Catherine Ma is not here to be part of the discussion, because she has a voice on an issue which is very important. We hear that voice. It will be slightly different from mine, but I think the whole spirit of St. Gallen is to hear more than one voice and then figure out what is the way forward in the context of speaking to between generations. But first of all, just a little background. The St. Gallen Symposium was established following and as a positive response to the riots in France in '68. And it's easy for us to forget how important those riots were. They started in Paris and London, Berlin, and then grew worldwide with conflict on university campuses in major cities everywhere. At the time, I was in my mid-20s and teaching at the London School of Economics, and much closer in age to the students who were protesting than the rest of the faculty. And the protests between the students and the university administration and faculty, the students really had a case. They were not being treated well by universities. But what then happened was the protests were taken over by the revolutionary left, and it became a conflict between capitalism and socialism and parliamentary democracy and autocratic government, and between some freedom of religion and the gods of the state. And because of this, 5 St. Gallen students decided to set up this symposium in a positive way to have intergenerational discussion. And we're here today in the Schmidheiny session because of the generosity of the Schmidheiny family. Max Schmidheiny, the father of Thomas Schmidheiny, I'm afraid because of the light I can't see if he's here, but I suspect he is here, felt deeply that because of their experience of creating wealth, freedom was critical to economic prosperity. Hence the argument, the market economy is of great value. It's not everything, but it is of great value. But more than that, they also believed that personal and political freedom under the rule of law was an essential aspect of human flourishing. And therefore, parliamentary democracy depended on personal freedom in society. And the title of this session is How to Guard Free Access to Information in Fragmented Societies. And I'd like to emphasize in these introductory remarks 3 points. I'd like to make 3 points about the issues raised. One is the freedom of the press. I believe the freedom of the press and the freedom of media is an absolute cornerstone of a liberal democracy and a free and open society. And about that, to me, there can be no debate, because freedom is something precious. The right to express one's opinions in public, to enter into debate without being cancelled, to campaign by peaceful means in open debate, to defend one's political, social, or religious point of view without being arrested. Freedom under the rule of law is a natural sequel of a belief in basic human dignity. And the St. Gallen Symposium was set up to defend the concept of an open and free society. And what I found is that at some time or another, most governments wish to protect the confidentiality of certain things, which frankly could be very legitimately made public, but they do so because they're slightly nervous. Some foreign governments who are clearly hostile to our Western values and way of life are attempting to undermine and distort information in our society. And some private interests may use the power of the market to distort the true picture of what's happening. The rule of law, the legal system, has an important part to play in protecting the freedom of the press. And the legal system exists in a parliamentary democracy to preserve access to information and to ensure that information is obtained by legitimate means. But freedom is only one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is responsibility. And I've mixed a lot with people in the media and in particularly the BBC and public media in the UK. And I have to say, I do feel that the people who run these institutions do have a strong sense of responsibility. The second point I'd like to make is that the word safeguard is very important in the title of safeguarding access to free information. And I would interpret that as impartiality between competing points of view. I think it's inherently extremely difficult to achieve. For example, how do you differentiate between balance, objectivity, neutrality, and the truth? How would you choose a chair or a chairperson or a CEO for a publicly funded newspaper or media company? What criteria would you use in appointing editors, producers, researchers, journalists? Do you expect them to leave their personal views at the door of the building as they enter for work? Each of these appointments, and I have personal experience from my own family in them, requires, in my judgment, good judgment, lots of experience, and a genuine commitment to discover the truth. Not necessarily the truth with a capital T and a capital T, but the truth in the normal day-to-day work of journalism. Journalism is, after all, a profession. One particular challenge, I feel, is that journalism tends to attract individuals of a progressive view rather than of a socially conservative view. And the question then arises, is it possible within an organization to maintain two cultures which are not quite the same and attract two kinds of individuals who are not quite the same? Is society ensuring that there are numerous providers to the answer? And if the government wishes to spend taxpayers' money to subsidize one or other provider, what justification can it make to do so in a really competitive market? And how much subsidy might be given by the finance ministry for it? Or is it best to scrap public funding altogether and have a free-for-all? These are very complex issues and need handling with care. And as I make this argument, I recognize that it'll be considered highly contentious to some, maybe many, in public broadcasting media. The problem is that I've used the word truth. And Michio Katukani, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning literary critic and former book critic of the New York Times, in writing a book called The Death of Truth, she expressed the issue as follows: the postmodernist argument that all truths are partial and a function of one's perspective led to the related argument that there are many legitimate ways to understand or represent an event. This both encouraged a more egalitarian discourse and made it possible for the voices of the previously disenfranchised to be heard. And interestingly, she argues that this risks confusing balance with truth-telling and willful neutrality with accuracy. And the example that she gives is, has the media attracted or given too much attention to climate deniers? The world of views and media has become increasingly competitive in the 21st century. And some, as I've argued that we should scrap all government funding. However, different countries which believe in freedom of the press have over now many decades invested in public institutions which play an important role in ensuring access to information. And in the UK, I naturally think of the BBC. There may be a case for change, and I personally believe there is a case for some change. But my instinct would be for public discussion of alternatives and a broad public discussion, followed by gradual change, rather than by having something like an immediate free-for-all. I mean, to give you an example, when I was in 10 Downing Street, I actually worked hard to advocate the case for independent production companies being allocated a fixed amount of time on the two major channels of the day, namely BBC and ITV. It's been a tremendous success, but it was an example of gradualism rather than revolution. The third issue I want to raise, which is in the title of today's title, and which in a way to me is almost the most important, is fragmented societies. Since the changes which have occurred going back to, let's say, the 1960s, there have been tremendous changes in our culture. And we've witnessed the increasing fragmentation in our societies on grounds of wealth, income, race, sexuality, gender, climate, nationality, populism, and so on. And I personally believe that there is a danger of creeping authoritarianism. You saw it recently when the mayor of Brussels and the police attempted to close down the National Conservative Conference, which was subsequently condemned by the Belgian Prime Minister and by the country's top constitutional court. You also saw it when Yanis Varoufakis, the former Greek finance minister, was prohibited from entering Germany. You see it in the use of the label hate speech to silence a legitimate point of view. And you saw it in the decision by the Council of Europe Strasbourg Court that the European Commission on Human Rights protected citizens from the adverse effects of global warming, raised incidentally by aging Swiss ladies, even though there seemed to be no discussion of the economic costs involved, as if they were negligible. The danger, it seems to me, of this, and I have to say, sometimes I'm guilty of it myself, is that anyone deviating in today's society, whether in public, in a parliament, in a corporation, in any sort of institution, if you deviate from a progressive standpoint, you then exercise self-censorship. And you actually withdraw from getting into debate. You just want the hassle of it. I believe that in addressing this issue, that something which is very important, because of the increasing evidence which is being shown of the effect of self-harm through social media in our fragmented societies, is the question of what holds our societies together. What is the social cohesion which holds our democracies together? Is it simply that we vote every so many years? Is there something more than that? It's very interesting. We go back to the Greeks, to Plato and Aristotle. They wrote and thought a lot about constitutions, but they also wrote about ethics, the Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle. And they talked about the virtues, and they talked about someone in public life and having influence as being a virtuous person. And I just wonder if there is a dimension here which we haven't really figured out how to handle. Because the way our society is going, fragmentation is taking place, social cohesion is less than it was, and therefore there's a greater onus on the family and on community to, in a way, stretch their wings open, and with a younger generation to take them closer in and to feel a greater responsibility for them. And in that connection, I'd like to leave you with a question raised by the distinguished French philosopher Raymond Aron in the last lecture he gave some years ago now in the Collège de France. I quote, "Our societies are legitimate in the eyes of its members, but they have no other ideal than that of permitting to each person the choice of one's path. I share this ideal. I participate in this manner of thinking of the society in which I live. But as an observer of societies in history, I ask myself, is it possible to give stability to democratic regimes of which the principle of legitimacy are elections, and of which the ideal is the right of liberty for everyone of choosing not only one's own path in life, which is just, but in addition, one's conception of good and evil?" I was terribly impressed by the opening statement of one of our organizing committee yesterday morning, and I want to quote it to you again. It was Elisha She was the first lady in the pink suit who spoke. And this is what she said. I feel so privileged, but at the same time, I feel lost and worried. Every morning I scroll through the news and I gasp. The headlines are depressing, and I can't help but wonder what's really going on in the world. What's real anymore? What's right and what's wrong? It's all a blur, and I can't figure out what to do. Most of all, I wonder, where are my role models? Coming over on the plane, I was reading Raymond Aron's lecture. He raised the issue of right and wrong. She raised the issue of right and wrong. Both of them are really at the heart of a culture. My conclusion is not that Western societies are condemned to die, or that the rest of the world should necessarily be like us. We've had many fortunate years since the Second World War. But I believe the questions raised by Arisha and Aron need to be answered. And they have to be answered by all of us, and not just the younger generation. Thank you.
So, Brian, thank you very much for your opening remarks. And also thank you very much for quoting our opening speech again. I feel quite honored, thank you. I had some questions prepared, and now with your opening remarks, you gave me again some new ideas for questions, so I hope I will find a good way to lead this dialogue here through this 20 or 15 minutes that we have left. Actually, I would like to start with one question that you were bringing up before. Are there enough providers to provide us with the different informations that we need? And you asked this question, but you didn't answer it. So do you have maybe an answer for us? Or what is your opinion on that topic?
Well, I think firstly, I can only speak with any real experience and authority on the UK. I would say in the UK, we have a press which covers right, left, and centre. So from that point of view, it's good. We have television stations which cover the waterfront. And we have the BBC, which was created in the early in the 19th century in order to provide balance. And when I was young, I started appearing on the BBC. Then I got involved with discussion about where the BBC should go. In number 10, I got involved again with what the BBC should be doing and so on. And I've kept up with that. As I said, within the family, I have discussions with one of my children and her husband, both of whom work for the BBC. And I would say the BBC, by and large, tries very hard to represent different points of view. So when it comes to the world of social media, I really know so little about social media, and I really can't say, whether there's enough variety on social media. I have a great friend of mine who's a professor emeritus of psychiatry. He says to me, looking at the empirical evidence, he very much agrees with Jonathan Haidt, the American who's been doing research on the subject, and he feels from research he's done in the UK that you really can see the effect of harm, particularly on adolescent girls and so on, which he feels is a serious problem. So it's not so much a question there of providing choice, it's a question of how do you, in a way, restrict access rather than... But, you know, as a liberal, I don't like restricting access. It kind of goes against one's nature to do it.
You look back on a long career in politics, and particularly in the UK, and also have witnessed how the media and information environment and its role of democracy, or its role for democracy, has also transformed. What are the greatest changes and also related challenges that you see there?
The greatest changes in the democracy?
In the role in the way how the media has changed and its role then for the democracy.
I think the media has become much more informal than what it used to be. Its style has completely changed. I think that the range of opinions on the media is much greater than it used to be. I still believe myself that there is such a thing as truth. And I think maybe in economics, which I know more about, there is, but some would question that. But I think today, in the media, people would say, you have your truth, he has his truth, she has her truth, I have my truth. That there is no such thing as truth as such. And that is why we have fragmentation and why we don't have cohesion. And why, if you go back, say, to 19th century Britain, you know, we for example, we took balanced budgets as a norm. Nobody in the 19th century, Gladstone, ever passed a bill and said there has to be a balanced budget. It was just part of the culture. Today, you couldn't assume anything like that. And I think in that sense, the media has been, of course, it's provided enormous information on so many things. And that's exciting. But I do think this question of everyone having their own interpretation of truth is a problem. That doesn't mean, if I was producing a program on, say, coal miners in Wales, and I had some politicians on, you know, I'd expect them to give a political view. I'd also want to have on a coal miner who'd been underground and had experienced what it's like to go into the dark at the beginning of the shift and see what's happening. So there would be different perceptions one would want to have, but that wouldn't be a different view of truth. And I think it is this idea that in the West today, we've really pulled the anchor, which is the Judeo-Christian civilization, and in a way you could say Greek and Roman thought. We sort of pulled this anchor up, and you know, if there's not much wind, it's fine, but when the winds start, then you really feel you do need an anchor, and that is something that's missing.
You were also talking now about those different concepts of truth and facts. And also, I mean, you have talked already before about the rise also of disinformation and fragmentation. But to what extent do these developments also show that there are limits of an approach only focuses on freedom? And also, to what extent do we need to review the rules and also the regulatory framework in which public debates are currently taking place?
Well, we just had a long debate in the House of Lords with a bill, which is the question, given the impact on teenagers which social media is having, how do we restrict access? And the immediate point is to say, let's have government controls. It's very interesting. There was a case in Britain. There was a young, relatively teenage girl, and she was listening a lot to social media, including things like suicide, violence, etc. And she suffered from anxiety. And in the end, it was very sad that she took her life. This week, in The Guardian, which is centre-left newspaper in Britain, there's an article by her father saying, although my daughter died as a consequence of being exposed to social media, I do not believe that advocating strong government censorship is the right thing to do, because I fear that they could introduce some very sloppy regulation which could actually produce in the end a worse outcome than you might imagine. But clearly, in terms of using iPhones in school, or using maybe smartphones more generally, I can see some sort of rules like that. But I go back to what I said at the lectern, that in the end, families have tremendous responsibility in giving time to their children and attention to their children as they grow up. I can tell you, I'm a father of 3, and, you know, bringing up children is hard work. And if you're a man, I can tell you, bringing up a son like the one I had is extremely hard work. And my wife will tell you, bringing up daughters is very hard work. So, you know, and this takes time. I'll give you an example of it. Every so often in number 10, we used to have, a few times a year, these great events. Mrs. Thatcher would hold a party, and she would invite celebrities, and there would be somebody from the world of media, sport, film, and so on. And they were great events. And then she'd invite a small group of us in number 10 to also invite guests, which it was a great thing to do. And there was one evening, I remember it written now as if it was yesterday, and the event was meant to start at 6:30. My wife called me at 6 o'clock, and she said, James, who was our son, she said, he's really playing up. Well, I said, you know, I can be home by 9:30 or something. She said, look, she said, if you want to have a relationship with him going forward, you need to come home now. I said, but I have this meeting. She said, I'm terribly sorry. If you want a relationship with him. So I put the phone down, and I thought, the last thing, what shall I do? I really have to, I think I have to go home, really. So I went to see Mrs. Thatcher. I said, Prime Minister, I said, I've got something terrible to say, because I've been involved in organizing this event this evening. I said, you know, what about James? She said, my dear Brian, she said, of course you have to go home. And I thought, she got it, you know. And I do think that issue of the fragmentation in society, we shouldn't blame technology and the media completely. We should say, we ourselves have to own the problem. And that means time, and that means sacrifice. And that's really hard work. And I'm not preaching at you at all, because, you know, I'm pointing at myself, because I find grandchildren much easier.
I would like to take up the topic about leadership again. And to quote also our opening speech again, we said, be honest, be courageous, and be open. But we see often difficulties also nowadays that people are not taking the courage to speaking up. And also, I mean, when we're organizing here the panels, it's always quite difficult to have still a panel that is contrary and really discussing and attacking each other, because, I mean, the media are just sharing everything on the internet, which then sometimes follow, excuse my French, to shitstorms and other bad news. So how can leaders remain authentic and still take courage to say what they really think in this environment that we have currently?
Well, I must say, I think earlier there were clearly differences on the first panel this morning between the person on the left, on my right, and the person on the left, the Hungarian and the man from, well, I was going to say the man from the European state, but he wasn't. I shouldn't say that. The man from the European Union, who had been the president of Latvia, I think. And I think what impressed me with both those people, and I think I would generalize it, that you have to respect that the other person has a point of view, and you have to respect that point of view, and you have to say, if there's some value in that point of view, how does it make me change what I really believe? And that's why I'm sorry that Catherine Ma is not here today, because I think she has a point of view. I would put it in the whole idea, if you're in broadcasting, it's a question of make sure you have the perception of somebody going down the coal mine, which you can't have from anybody else other than somebody who's gone down the coal mine. So if we're thinking of the issue of race or the issue of trans or something like that, it's very important that there's personal testimony. But on the other hand, you know, that to me, you must conduct a conversation like that in the right spirit. What you mustn't do is lose your cool and you know, put in the first punch. That's a favourite in Welsh rugby.
So to have, oh, sorry. No.
I was going to say, or maybe Swiss ice hockey.
Maybe as a final question, because unfortunately our time is already over. We are at the greatest and cross-generational leading conference or platform in Europe, or maybe on the whole world. So there needs to be a cross-generational question. You see currently that young people are using different medias than the more experienced generations. So going forward, how can we use media in a way that it connects the generation instead of dividing them?
You know, in Jurassic Park, we don't have the right equipment. It's like, frankly, I mean, you're talking to somebody who's like an alcoholic, you know, a really bad example. There's a huge difference. It's as if we're talking different language, because it's the speed with which somebody can adjust something technically, which is very important. But, you know, I do listen to podcasts, and I refuse to join things like Instagram, because I don't want to give personal details in that sense. So that's why I don't do that. But I really do think that in time, because it's going to, as we get older and die off, it'll actually sort itself out.
But you know, we could also just give you an Instagram account afterwards if you would like to.
Meanwhile, I just ask for mercy from the audience.
So with that, thank you very, very much, Lord Brian. And please keep seated, because we're going to have our next session just starting immediately after this one. Thank you very much for listening.